Welcome to Understanding. I'm Craig Biddle, and today I'm joined by Zachary Porcu, and we're going to talk about the foundations of knowledge. Welcome, Zach.
Thank you for having me.
All right. Before we get started, would you just let my audience know a little bit about who you are and what you do?
I'm a philosopher turned church historian. I did my PhD in church history at the Catholic University of America, and I'm a professor turned Substacker and podcaster. And I now teach online, and I teach classes for St. Athanasius College online, and I do catechism at my parish. And I have a lot of interest in philosophy and epistemology, which is what we're going to talk about today.
Yes, indeed. Well, thank you for that, and welcome to the show. I'm really happy to have you here. I discovered you, as I was telling you just before we turned the camera on, a few months ago. You were doing a series on your podcast channel. By the way, I love the name of your channel, The Roots of Everything. That's that definitely catches the attention of someone like me. So that's what sucked me in, I have to say. And you were talking about epistemology and specifically about the foundations of knowledge. I believe in the first one I listened to, you were talking about Descartes. And so I was like, hey, this is the kind of stuff I love to talk about, especially the intersection of epistemology, how we know what we know, and how we validate that with ethics. How are we going to apply that knowledge, once we have it? So what I'd like to talk about to you today, as we've already agreed, is knowledge and the foundations of knowledge. And these are very simple words to say, but when you start unpacking them, they get pretty rich. So let's begin, if you will. Why don't you just give me and my audience just a sort of an introduction to what you think knowledge is and how we ground it, if we ground it.
Oh, that's all.
Just that. Ready? Go.
Yeah.
Take your time.
Well,
Well, this will be a spiraling conversation. You don't have to spit it all out at once.
sure. So something that's very important to the way that I think we think about these things is the history of these things. And so when we're talking about philosophy, you can't just do series of propositional arguments. Those are useful and good, obviously, but there's more to it than that. And I think if you're trying to unpack knowledge and how we relate to knowledge now in 2025, what we're doing is we're having a discussion about something that's been in progress for about 1,000 years. And it's important to have that context in mind. Because one of the ways on one of my other series, we were talking about, well, what is modernity and what is post-modernity? How do we define those things? And I said, one of the most iconic and sort of descriptive ways that you could define modernity is that we have a very special relationship to knowledge. It's very specific that other ages like the medieval era and the ancient world did not have. And in my epistemology series, I said we have a really neurotic relationship to knowledge. Actually, we have this obsession with questions about certainty and how do we define certainty and how do we have certainty, and those kinds of questions philosophers have been circling at least since Descartes. That's where a lot of philosophy courses start this. I would argue there's precedent to this in the medieval era. We could talk about that if you want. But Descartes really ends up being the sort of program director for the project of modern philosophy in general, but especially epistemology. And so I'll tell you an embarrassing story. This is relevant, actually. When I was 14 years old, my dad showed up with a bunch of books that he had got at a yard sale, and they were all Descartes and Nietzsche, Hume, Kant, all this stuff, little short text with selections from them. And he's like, "You like books? I found these." And I was 14, and I just picked up Descartes' Meditations on First Philosophy, and I read through it. And if for those of you who don't know, this is where he questions how we know anything at all. And the proposal he gives is that we should radically doubt everything that can possibly be doubted until we arrive at that thing that can't possibly be doubted, and that's what we can have absolute certainty about. And I was an earnest 14-year-old, and I was completely taken in by this. I had no philosophical training, no context, historical context for what he was doing. And I did it. I was just like, yeah, let's doubt everything possible. And I was a complete wreck for the rest of my teenage years. And it took me, I transferred high schools to take a philosophy course at a high school that offered that. And then I, woke up one day and I was majoring in philosophy in undergraduate. And I kind of made this solving the Descartes problem, how do we know stuff, as sort of the central focus of my interest and my concern. Because I was stressed out. I couldn't sleep at night. And so this question is very personal to me. And I think it's very practical too. Epistemology often gets short shrift for being abstract and whatever. But how do you know what you know is like you do this every second of every day. So anyway, I kind of got to the bottom of this question in a way that satisfied me. And a big part of that was understanding the way that question was situated historically, which is what was Descartes responding to, and what did that lead to? It led to Hume, it led to Kant, it led to basically all of Western philosophy having this obsession with solving Descartes' problem. And to give a very simple answer, the answer I give in that episode of in that series on epistemology, it's that the problem with Descartes and what becomes paradigmatic for Western philosophy after that is that he starts with the presupposition, the assumption that knowledge is problematic. And easy way to say this is the whole idea of, he basically says that knowledge is guilty until proven innocent, and instead of innocent until proven guilty. And you might overgeneralize previous ages and say they assumed that things were knowable until it was problematic. It was innocent until proven guilty. And when you start that way by problematizing knowledge, there's just no way to get out of the Descartes trap. That's why Kant and Hume fail in my view, to escape the Descartes trap, because they don't question his fundamental starting point. And so when that isn't done formally until, I would argue, people like Hans-Georg Gadamer and Michael Polanyi in the 20th century. So that's a long time. That's 500 years later that it's really assessed. And what they do is they take apart everything that's going on in the Enlightenment, where the Enlightenment assumes that knowledge is somehow abstracted. Rationality can be autonomous. You can use a method to create certainty. And they say, we know that there's no such thing as pure reason. Not because they're postmodernists who don't believe in reason, but because everything is contextualized in persons. So the quote that I kind of lit up when I heard it, when I was reading Polanyi's book, Meaning, he said, all knowledge is personal, participation through indwelling. And he doesn't mean, this is what modern people think, he doesn't mean everything's subjective and that there is no way to arrive at truth. He means that, and I talk about this in my book a little, all knowledge is participatory. So in order to know something, you have to participate in it. You know your relationship with your spouse because you have knowledge. That's participatory knowledge. It's something that you participate in. So you can only know things from the inside. That was kind of what the hermeneutics guys ended up concluding, in contrast to the Enlightenment guys who thought you could know stuff from the outside. You stand away from it, you look down on it, you don't enter into it because that would bias you, and that's, they're terrified of bias, and they're terrified of prejudice. Kant basically has a prejudice against prejudice. And so the upshot of all this, I'm massively overgeneralizing, I'll end with this, is that in traditional epistemologies, as far as I can tell, everyone just accepts that you can know things from the inside, and rather than creating the perfect method to know something. And I think we all know this at an intuitive level. You know your relationships. You know what it's like everyone who's been a waiter. I was a waiter when I was a teenager. Everyone who's been a waiter is like a veteran from the same war, because everyone knows what it's like to be a waiter. Everybody knows what it's like to be in academia or to be married or to whatever. And you know these things from the inside. And so it's personal. Knowledge is personal, but it's not therefore relative or subjective or up to the determination of each individual person, which is sort of the dichotomy that they get into with the Enlightenment guys versus the Romantics. And so there's a lot of other elements to that, like virtue. That's what the ancients would say. That's what the great thinkers of Christendom would say. They would say, if knowledge is personal, that means you have to be a good knower of knowledge. And so you actually need virtue to know things well. And a good example of that is, if you're too angry or bitter or resentful or anxious or whatever, and you've talked to people like this or been this person yourself where you're just too kind of stuck in something to be able to see it objectively. And you have to go to a friend and say, hey, am I off my rocker here? And so a lot of these things are very intuitive, but that's kind of the large overview, highly overgeneralized answer to your question, basically.
Yeah, and that's a good intro, a good place to start in talking about what knowledge is and what are the elements that make it up, and why we even need these concepts of knowledge and epistemology and method and all of that. I did get something was unclear in there that I'd like to get clear on. So in one sense, you were giving sort of a historic overview, beginning with who I think is the father of modern philosophy as well, Descartes. But in another sense, it sounded like you were just giving that, not saying what you think knowledge is. So is it your view that knowledge is individual or personal? And what is the essence of your position on what knowledge is and how we get it?
Yeah, that was unclear. You're right. So I came to conclude that Polanyi and Gadamer and these guys are right in that knowledge is participatory. It's personal in that sense, although I would be clear, it's not individual, because knowledge is something outside of individuals. Truth is something that is outside of me and not inside of me, meaning it's something that I can conform to objectively, if you want to use that language, not something that I decide or make up or will into being. But it does have this personal participatory component that's essential to it. And so when I became Eastern Orthodox in undergraduate, what I realized is that Christianity, traditional Orthodox Christianity, offers this same extremely robust vision of what knowledge is. It's deeply participatory through the concept of the sacraments. So the sacraments in Orthodoxy, the word in Greek is mysterion, mystery. That's what sacrament means in Latin. Sacrament is just a Latin word for the Greek word mystery. And what they mean by that word is not what, your generic bad Sunday school teacher meant when the kid says, well, how could God be three in one? And the teacher says, it's a mystery. Don't ask questions. That's like that. And we're not saying that. We're not saying stop asking questions and don't think about it. What we're saying is by mystery, we mean something you can only know through participation. And I think that's why all throughout the biblical imagery and the imagery of the church fathers, the sacraments of the church, the unity of the individual person with Christ, all of these things are described very, very frequently in terms of erotic imagery. The bride awaiting the wedding night, the bride and the bridegroom, the wedding feast of the Lamb. There's all this wedding erotic imagery in this. And you're like, well, why? Because a marriage is something that you really can only understand by entering into it. You can't really understand it from the outside. You just have to do it. People can't prepare you for it. And you learn it from the inside. And that's kind of the understanding and orthodoxy of our relationship to all knowledge, with this additional element, which is that when Christ says, I am the way, the truth, and the life, what does he mean by that? So, and the answer is, he is the truth itself. This is an very old Christian idea that truth exists, and it's sort of objective in that sense, but it is a person, Christ the Logos. That's why John he appropriates all this Greek philosophy language, like the Logos, in the beginning was the Logos, all that stuff, because he wants to talk about Christ in these terms as truth itself. But it's also a person. So then you have to have a personal relationship with truth, and that's where this whole sort of participatory thing comes from. Does that kind of make sense?
Yeah, I get where you're coming from on that now, and now it's clear what your sort of theory is of knowledge. Well, we have some agreement and a lot of disagreement, so I'll start
I'm
with
sure.
some agreement. I certainly view both thinking and knowledge as an active process. Thinking is an active process. You know, things don't just fall into your mind and you know them. If you want to know things, you have to activate your mind and think. You have to look and integrate and conceptualize and generalize and do the things. You know, these are all verbs. You have to act. So thinking, in my view, is definitely an active process, and gaining knowledge, so knowledge being, you know, a mental grasp of facts of reality, is, you know, there's two parts there. There's the mental grasp, that's the action of consciousness, and there's of what? Of facts of reality, and that's external. So there's an in here and an out there. Um, and I also agree that thinking is individual. It's individuals who think. Individuals have minds and sensory apparatuses, and we use those to perceive the world and integrate ideas and know. Groups do not do that. Societies do not do that. Societies and groups are simply made up of individuals. So I think there's some agreement, no doubt some disagreement there as well, but certainly I would agree that it's an active process, so you have to do something, and that it's very individual, at least in the respects that I've suggested. Where I think we differ, and this might be a fruitful place to sort of probe, is you said that truth is out there. Truth is independent of the mind, and this is sort of the realist idea to some extent, that, you know, truth is out there or goodness is out there if we're talking about ethics. And I think there's a crucial distinction to be made here, and that is between truth, which I regard as an epistemological and metaphysical concept. It has a foot in both camps, because I regard truth as recognition of a fact of reality, not just fact of reality. I think fact of reality is strictly metaphysical. It's what is, regardless of whether we do any recognizing or any identifications of or any acknowledgement of. All of those kinds of words, concepts, recognition, identification, and the like, are both epistemological and metaphysical. They have that dual thing. So the way I would put it is, and this is tracking with, as I mentioned to you, I'm a fan of Ayn Rand and the objectivist philosophy. Rand called this the primacy of existence, which means existence just is what it is out there. And consciousness exists and it's real, but its job is to understand what is reality, what existence is. So consciousness, as she put it, is, whereas existence is identity, to be is to be something, consciousness is identification, at least insofar as we're talking about consciousness as an active process. Going back to your idea that it's an active process to know. And I bring this up now because even though this is really, we're down in the depths of epistemology here, because I think this is what distinguishes objectivity, which I think is the connection of the mind, consciousness, to external reality, that knowing process. We can call that the method of objectivity. And I think we need to distinguish that from two, what I regard, false alternatives. One is intrinsicism, the idea that truth and goodness are out there, intrinsic in the world apart from us. So this would be Platonic, the world of forms. It's out there. The truths are out there, whether we know them or not, they're there. The goodness, the form of the good, is up there, whether we know it or not, it's there. I dispute that. I say no, for truth to exist, there has to be a mind in connection with reality. And for goodness to exist, there has to be a mind along with a purpose in order for something to be good. For something to be good, you've got to have a to whom, the agent, and a for what. What's this thing good for? And I would differentiate objectivity both from that, which I and Ayn Rand call intrinsicism, and from subjectivism, which is the other side of that, what I regard a false coin, which is that everything is just in here, right? Everything is just in the mind, so it's all subjective. And as you know, historically in philosophy, this tracks with all sorts of things, right? The uh, the realists hold that everything is just out there, and the subjectivists hold that everything is just in here. This goes all the way through metaphysics and even theories of concepts.
Hmm.
So I think this trichotomy, and this will be the last thing I say, and then I'll let you filter in here. I think this trichotomy of objectivity, meaning the active process of a mind knowing what is out there, it needs to be distinguished from intrinsicism. The stuff is just out there. Truth and goodness are out there. And also, usually, what comes with intrinsicism is mysticism, the idea that, and those truths and goodnesses can just be sort of planted in our mind by an external force. And this is kind of what a revelation is, or at least what I take a revelation to be. And then the third one being subjectivism. Oh, it's just all in here. We just make shit up, man. Reality is whatever the group says it is, or whatever I say it is. So there's personal and collective subjectivism. Anyway, I'd be interested in your thoughts on that trichotomy and how your views might integrate with or oppose that.
So let me make sure I understand this correctly, because obviously you're calling it intrinsicism, probably more like more often it's called realism versus subjectivism, but that's fine. But objectivism here, are you saying that the truth is something like an emergent object between the interaction of the knower and the thing known? Is that
Well, I
like
wouldn't say it's emergent. Yeah.
I'm having a hard time distinguishing it from realism.
Got it. And I actually recently wrote a short paper on this distinction, but it was specifically realism versus anti-realism in ethics. But it
Hmm.
also applies to epistemology in very much the same way.
Hmm.
So I wouldn't say that truth. What was the verb you used there? Is it
Emergent.
emergent? Yeah, I don't think it's an emergent property because that's got a passivity to it that I'm
Hmm.
trying to avoid. Truth is something you have to actively pursue
Hmm.
to understand reality, to really get a mental grasp of what is. You have to do the work, and I
Yeah,
believe in and actually I think the locus of free will is precisely the choice to do that work or not. That's your
sure.
choice. That's the thing we get to choose. And so the difference between what I'm saying and calling objectivity or objectivism with a lowercase o here, because I'm not now talking, I use capital O for Ayn Rand's philosophy of objectivism. But if we're talking about objectivism as against the
Yeah.
two alternatives here, then it's a lowercase o. And the difference between it and traditional realism in this area, which is what I'm referring to as intrinsicism, is this. Realism is, in my view, a vague term that sort of packages together two things that crucially need to be kept apart if we're going to have clarity on these issues. Either it's true that truth and goodness are out there, completely independent of our needs, purposes, aims, goals, etc., or it's not true. So it's one or the other, law of excluded middle. And what I'm trying to say is if you package into realism two different ideas, the Platonic idea that yes, truth and goodness are out there independent of us.
Hmm.
And this is sort of the Kantian view too, except that the truth and goodness are the moral law within, but it's still independent of our needs, concepts, etc. Or you can say if it's coming from the noumenal world, again, independent of us, it's being imposed on us in effect. Realism seems to package that together with what I'm talking about. And I think that that's a very confusing package. So I think we need a third alternative here to make clear that there are three different things. There's the idea that these things are just out there. There's the idea that they're just in here in the head. And then there's the idea that that truth and goodness are a relationship between an active mind and the facts of reality.
How does that not just? Hmm. Okay. You're tempting me to go back into my analytic training and start doing all these reductionist things.
Take your time and do as you wish. I'm very curious about your ideas, and I just want clarity on what your thinking is. So,
Yeah, my sort of hypothetical concern at this juncture is that this is just another way to articulate realism. Uh, but let me let me because if you remove the knower on your view, it sounds like you remove the ontological status of truth at all. Like if a tree falls in the woods and no one hears it, it doesn't make a sound. Kind of like that. That seems like what's going on with
and
objectivism.
I would agree that if a tree falls in the woods and no one's there to hear it, doesn't make a sound. It makes sound waves, but the sound is precisely the interaction of those sound waves on an eardrum that then is processed by the brain to generate the experience of sound. So without the hearer, yeah, I would say there is no sound.
Well, then it sounds like your worldview must assume God uh, because otherwise it becomes reducible to subjectivism. Because if the knower is required for the known to have ontological status, then you have a problem. You have an ontology problem about what actually is the truth, the object of your knowledge. If it's not independent of you, but it depends on you, then you sort of, does that make sense?
Yeah, so we need to make what we can call the form object distinction here. And that is there's the form in which I experience and know something out there. And at the perceptual level, just stay there because it's easier to start with. If I see a tree or hear a tree fall in the woods, take it either way, what is happening? Well, I'm experiencing and I'm knowing the tree. I'm knowing that the tree exists by means of a particular form, and that is vision or hearing, auditory. It's either auditory or visual in that case. But that form has to be kept distinct from the object. The object is the thing I'm perceiving, and the form is the means by which I perceive it. And so my theory isn't saying that it wouldn't raise an ontological or metaphysical problem, because the fact that let's take the tree falling in the woods. Tree falls in the woods. Does it make a sound if no one's there to hear it? Well, let's take it one step at a time. Did the tree fall? Well, that's the premise. It fell. So we're going to say it did. It fell. When a tree falls, do we know that it creates waves through the air that we call sound waves? Well, we know that. So we can say, yes, that happened. So ontologically or metaphysically, we don't have any problem here. We know, yes, the tree fell and it made waves. We're just getting to the form of knowledge if someone is there to hear and see it, or no one is there to hear or see it. If you're there to hear or see it, then you're going to experience it in these two forms. You're going to see it falling. You're going to hear the sound waves of it going or whatever it does. But those are different things. The form and the object are different. And I think this is a big problem in the history of philosophy, is that philosophers have conflated these. Immanuel Kant certainly did. That's sort of the essence of the problem with Kantian um, with Kant's epistemology is that he's conflating form and object. He's saying we don't perceive reality; we just perceive our perceptions. But we don't perceive perceptions. If you see a tree falling, you see a tree falling, and you see a tree falling. So the verb is the active part that you participate in, and the thing we're talking about is the object. And I just think it's really crucial to keep them distinct.
But I thought you were going one way. So the tree falls, that's the object. So there is a reality to the tree falling. The form is the perception of the tree falling, the light waves, the sound waves, whatever. And then the
Well,
individual.
the way in which those affect your senses, which is literally direct contact with reality, right? Because light waves hit your eyes,
Mhm.
sound waves hit your eardrum. So it's
Yeah.
literally direct contact with external reality.
But it sounds like you're still viewing the sound waves and the light waves as an intermediary between the fact that the tree fell and the knower's perception of it.
Well, you don't perceive sound waves. Sound waves hit your eardrums and cause your eardrums to send to your brain signals that manifest as sound. But what you're hearing is the tree falling. So
So you
the
don't
tree
have a
is the thing.
problem. You don't have a problem with the what we would call in philosophy the like naive or brute apprehension of reality. Like we apprehend reality directly.
I think we do apprehend reality directly. I think apprehend can be an equivocal term sometimes. So I like to say we just perceive reality directly. But the spirit of your point there, I think I agree with. Yeah.
Well, so like, let me give you a contrast. Because like in Kant, you could say that Kant does this with the categories, or Hume, Hume ends up saying like, well, we can't really know if this billiard ball caused the other one. But all of that has an antecedent in the medievals. So Thomas Aquinas has this whole concept of the phantasma in Latin. I don't know. I'm reticent to translate it into English, but basically it's this idea that there's something. So this is kind of medieval epistemology slash physics. There's some intermediary thing in between the knower and the known that delivers the whatever qualities of the known object to the knowing mind. And that concept of an intermediary phantasma in the way he thinks about it, but I see that as kind of running through all of Western modern philosophy. And I think that in one form or another, again, you could say Kant's categories are like that. And so my concern always with epistemology is that in the West, we have this 1,000-year-long history of saying there is an intermediary between the knower and the known. And then we problematize that because that means at some level, the implication is we aren't really brutally or naively perceiving reality as such. It's always mediated through a method, through the senses, etc. So, of course, as you know, for Descartes, the fact that the senses err from time to time is a crisis, actually. It's an epistemic crisis because they're not reliable transmitters. And I think it's because he's coming into the conversation with this medieval context that there is this sort of methodological, psychological intermediary between the mind and the world. And when you problematize that, suddenly you just kind of lose all certainty. Whereas the really easy answer to everything is to just do what Occam does, sort of, which is assume that no, everyone yells at Occam. But then I actually read him in grad school, and I was like, none of this is there. I don't know why people said this about him. Anyway, that's another conversation. But you just deproblematize the whole thing. You say there is no intermediary. We just perceive the world pretty much as it is, and the reason that you make mistakes is not because your senses are lying to you or something like that. It's that knowledge it's not a binary. It doesn't just turn on and off. I either got the right answer from my senses or I didn't get the right answer from my senses. It's something that grows over time, as you perceive the world better and more clearly. I mean, my daughter's 2 almost, and it's been such a weird joy. It's been a joy, but it's been like a weird epistemic adventure to watch her identifying things in the world more and more clearly and making these kind of relationships. And it's not because her faculties are like getting better at perceiving material reality. Exactly. There's this conceptual framework that she's building that she inherits socially. And so I'm going to stop and let you respond to that, but I want to come back to, I'm going to write this down. I want to come back to the social / individual dimension of epistemology, because you said groups don't do that. But I want to maybe problematize that for you, but we'll
Yeah.
come back to that.
let's revisit that later because that is an area I think where where it could be interesting to talk more. My daughter is 22, so I know a lot
Mm.
about what you're going through now, and it is a joy to watch. It's really wonderful to see a young mind develop, and
Hmm.
it's also instructional because when we look at our daughters developing, what we're seeing, and you just alluded to this, is that their sensory faculties actually are not improving. Their sensory faculties are just perfect out of the gate. Now, this not in the first few days because the
Yeah.
eyes haven't even opened. But you've got a 2 year old. Your 2 year old can hear just as well as you can. She
Yeah.
can see just as well as you can. She can taste, touch, smell just as well as you can. And I think this is an important point because what our direct contact with reality is precisely the evidence of the senses. And I think there is no intermediary between the object and the mind other than the means of perception. Now, if you want to call the means of perception an intermediary, fine. But I think means of perception is better. And this is where, if you treat the fact that you have a means of perception as problematic because your sensory apparatus is, quote, filter the data as it comes in or distort the data as it comes in. And of course, this is what Kant claims and others claimed. Then what you have is you wind up with the conclusion that we're not perceiving reality, we're perceiving the distortions that our senses do. But this is really interesting, and Ayn Rand had a great way of thinking about this. Um, if we're going to perceive reality by no means, then that's ridiculous. That doesn't make any sense at all. You perceive reality by how? By no how. I just perceive
Right.
it. Right? That doesn't make any sense. So if you say by perceiving reality through sight or hearing, you are therefore distorting it so you're not perceiving reality. Rand replied to this in speaking specifically about Kant. She said essentially he's saying man is blind because he has eyes, deaf because he has ears, and deluded because the things he thinks he perceives don't perceive because he perceives them.
Yep.
Right, or something like that. I'm probably not quoting her flawlessly, but you get the idea. So it's just a false view to think that the way to really get real reality, to use Kantian terms, is to perceive by no means whatsoever. But we can't do that. So the best we can do is just make up categories in our mind that we collectively all engage in, and that's the phenomenal world we experience. But that doesn't make any sense. There's no evidence of an intermediary, and there's no evidence that we're distorting anything. There's just the fact that if I look at a tree, I see the tree. If I blur my eyes, the tree gets blurry, but that doesn't mean I'm looking at a blurry tree. It means that the thing I've done has changed to some extent the way I'm perceiving, but the tree is still the tree. It's not a blurry tree, it's just a tree. If I'm colorblind and you're not, and you can see the green leaves, but I only see gray leaves, we're still seeing leaves. We're just seeing them in a different form. So the form object distinction, I think, is crucial. And in my view, I just don't see any evidence for or reason to accept that there's an intermediary there. And last thing, and then I'll let you speak.
Hmm.
In my view, the senses cannot err. So I want to go back to Descartes, who thinks that he thinks that, well, maybe an evil demon is setting this up so that everything is a delusion. The, your senses can't err in this sense. It's simply causal determinism that if light hits your eyes and if your eyes are still properly functioning, that is going to causally affect your brain and you're going to see. That's just what it is. This is all deterministic causation at the physical level. Now we can misunderstand what we are looking at. If you see a stick in a glass of water so that it looks bent under the water and not out, right? This we know is not actually a bent stick. And the reason we know that is multifold. A, we can pull it out and see that it's not bent. And B, through physics and deeper understanding, we know that refraction, the fact that light travels at a different speed and in different ways through water than it does through air, causes what seems to be an illusion. So it's not that our senses are failing us when we see that. Our senses are literally giving us all of the information. It's up to our conscious mind to figure out, well, how do I decipher what I'm looking at? So anyway, back to perception, and then I think I'm talking too much here, so I'll let you get some words in. I think perception is unerring in that sense, and that the responsibility then becomes on our conception, the conceptual faculty, to figure things out that might appear to be contradictory.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's exactly right. Because, and I said this, the example I used in class one time was, if somebody makes an artificial tree or an artificial fruit or something, and it's sitting on the desk over there, and you're like, oh, that's a pear. And then you get up there and you're like, oh, actually, this is a wax pear. It wasn't that your senses deceived you. That's not what we're talking about. We're talking about your senses saw that. It was just a conceptual framing, like you said, So that's good. Okay. Because this is actually very important to get right, because at some level, the entire history of Western philosophy from Descartes is about like having an existential crisis over this distinction. And then what they do historically in one way or another is they say, okay, well, to fix the knower, the gap between the knower and the known, we're going to invent a method, and the method is going to save us. And the criticism of that was that, I like this Rand quote, I hadn't heard it before, that about Kant, where we're blind because we have eyes. And that's such a good criticism of the Enlightenment, because these guys really think that any amount of personal involvement creates biases that distort your perception. It ruins everything. And so we need to create all these objective methods, in which, not in the sense that Rand uses the term, but in the epistemic sense, we need to create objective methods. And what we mean by objective methods is depersonalization. You've got to remove the person as much as possible, so that way you can get like a pure sample or whatever. You probably know all this. And so the Gadamer and the guys I mentioned who end up criticizing the Enlightenment in the 20th century, they call this the view from nowhere. I don't know if you've heard that. And the view from nowhere, it's like, who's perceiving it then? And that's why the conclusion is that knowledge has to be personal. And maybe this lines up with what you're saying about how there has to be a knower to know this knowledge. So that's great. I think that's right, because then the problem is, how do we form our conceptual framework properly? And this gets me back to what I wanted to mention, because you said at the beginning, I agree with you that there's this sort of individual center to knowing. And the way that I would talk about, and you may not be making this distinction, but in Orthodox theology of the person, some Orthodox scholars make the distinction between the concept of the person and the concept of the individual. And so one way to look at it, not that you're necessarily looking at it this way, but one way to look at it is to say that the concept of the autonomous rational individual is a modernist sort of Enlightenment anthropology. So, as you may know, the Enlightenment guys thought that, you're an individual, John Locke, blank slate, Rousseau, you start free, you start rational, you start as an individual, and then you sort of tolerate various dependencies. Like in Rousseau, that's the family. Like, you tolerate it, and then as soon as you can get away from that and go back to being an individual, you should, you must. And so the idea of the autonomous rational individual using method to determine what's actually going on, I think that's also implicatable in this thing that we're criticizing, because the epistemology can't be divorced from anthropology. And that's why I wanted to bring in this social element, because it's not that you're a free autonomous individual. If the problem, like you said, I think correctly, is that the real problem of epistemology is, what's your conceptual framework? How are you interpreting all of this stuff? Interpretive lens, hermeneutic, I call it imaginative framework in my show, whatever you want to call it. And that, I think, is something that's inherited socially and culturally, because you're formed in a culture. And that culture gives you perceptions about the world that actually affect what you see. And so the if maybe you're I'm just going to use it. I don't necessarily want to talk about the existence of spirits, but I'm going to use it as an example to make it kind of clear, which is our culture, materialist culture, says there's no such thing as spirits. There's only matter and energy. And the epistemic question would be, well, what if there are spirits, but when you stop believing in them, you lose the ability to see them? And we know that in a lot of clinical cases, if we test the subject in a certain way, the subject stops being able to see things that are physically there because of the cues we give them. So you probably know the famous gorilla suit experiment. I'll summarize it quickly for your listeners, which is, the tester shows the subject a video and he says, I want you to count how many times, it's this basketball video, count how many times this team passes the ball or how many times the ball is passed or whatever. It's been done many, many times. And then they play the video and then they watch it. And then at the end, the person says, it's 22, right? Did I get it right? And the scientist says, yes, you did get it right. Good job. Did you see the guy in the gorilla suit? And they're like, what? And he says, yeah, a guy in a gorilla suit very slowly walks into the middle of the frame, waves, and then walks very slowly off. And the subject is like, no, that's crazy. I would have noticed that. And then they play it back, and sure enough, it's there, and everybody's flabbergasted. And this experiment has been repeated over and over and over again in a different context with different gimmicks. They change the curtain color. They do all kinds of stuff. And it was used initially to say that, oh, well, see, eyewitness testimony is super unreliable. That's one takeaway for courtroom kind of application. But I kind of fell out of my chair and I said, guys, that has massive implications for epistemology and especially for materialism, for the Enlightenment's kind of conception of the world, which is that the Enlightenment guys assume, in another weird way, that you sort of naively perceive the physical world reliably. I mean, that's the only reason empiricism works. So they kind of have this weird contradiction. Anyway, but I said, look, if your entire culture tells you and schools you that there are no such thing as spirits, for example, maybe you lose the ability to see them. But I mean, and that's just one example. I'm not trying to invite a conversation on that specifically, but I think it's a very dramatic example that works for what I'm trying to illustrate here. And so this is my big concern then, is what's the social conceptual framework? What's your culture's inherited imaginative framework? And are we taking seriously the massive effect that has even on your ability to perceive physical reality?
Yeah, so I agree 100% that your culture and your environment have a massive effect on you, because that, you can't know things you don't encounter, right? So if you grow up in a family that reads lots of books, you're going to be introduced to books at an early age, and you can know the joy of reading. If you grow up in a family that doesn't have any books in the house, you never even heard of a book, you're not going to experience books until hopefully later in life. You'll get with the program. But environment matters, and genetics matter. You have, if you're born unfortunately with Down syndrome, that's a very different kind of life you're going to live than if you're born with an average IQ or a high IQ, right? So genetics matter. But the third thing that really matters that a lot of people drop is volition, free will. You get to choose how you're going to react to things in your environment, how you're going to what choices you're going to make among alternatives. Fundamentally, what choice you're going to make every time you get to either activate your mind and think about something or not do so, right? And again, I mentioned earlier that I think the locus of free will is there. And this is an individual activity, this choice to think or not to think. It's also an individual case that you and your environment are yours. I grew up in a different environment from you. We have different environments, right? So it's still personal at that level. And your genetics are personal to you. There's a lot of commonality, no doubt, in our genetics, but also very different. I mean, you have dark hair. I call it blonde, but I'm told it's gray. In any event, so there's that. I agree with you that the environment matters, your social engagement matters, and you learn from other people. I learned from teachers throughout my life, and if I didn't have them as teachers, at least the good ones, I would have been ignorant on those subjects unless I had figured them out some other way. I was also taught things, as I'm sure you were, that were not true in school. So you can be taught falsehoods by your parents, preachers, and teachers as well. Um, as for souls and or spirits, I am not a materialist, not at all. I regard us human beings as beings of mind and body, matter and spirit. Both things are there. I use spirit and soul in a secular way. I think that I always ask, what facts of reality give rise to the need of a concept we're using, right? I get this from Rand. This is what I call her objectivity question. And either there are facts that give rise to our need of something like the concept of soul or spirit, or there are not. It's one or the other. Law of excluded middle again. So why do we need the concept of spirit or soul or consciousness, which is, I think, the broader category here, because I think spirit and soul are just aspects of consciousness that that are embedded with values. So you're born and you open your eyes and you're conscious of the world, but you don't have any values yet. You don't care about football. You don't care about your favorite band yet. You don't have a favorite band. You're not in love with anyone yet, right? You have no values. So I think the facts that give rise to the need of a concept like spirit or soul are simply the fact that as human beings develop and their consciousness develops uh, values and disvalues, things they love, things they hate, that becomes who you are. I think we're all self-made people in large part because of the choices that we make, and that the values we choose and the way that we integrate values into our life and our consciousness, that's what, to me, the concept of spirit or soul denotes. So I do agree that we have those things, and I'm not a materialist. I'm not religious, and I don't regard any of this as supernatural. I regard it as just the nature of human beings to have these characteristics. Um, and then lastly, I'm trying to address the various things that you brought up, which were quite a few and rich. Um, when you talk about knowledge and sort of a social aspect of it, as I've already said, and I agree, you learn from other people. It's one of the great things about other people is that we can learn from them, so we can gain knowledge from them, and then we can trade with them. We can trade value for value. You make hot cakes and I make, sausage, and we can exchange them. Um, but it remains the fact, I think, that the knower and the thinker and the agent in all cases is individual. And I loved Walter Williams, the economist who passed away several years ago, because he always took his economic discussions kind of down to the personal level, rather than talking about macroeconomics all the time. He was just always like, suppose I have $1 and you have a banana, So it's like two guys and a trade. And I think it's good to think about epistemology this way too, at base. So let's take the person out of society and put him on an island. He's all alone on an island. There's no one else there. Does he need knowledge, and does he need a method to gain it? I think he does. I think he needs to figure out whether the berries are edible and how to catch the fish he saw in the pond. And he needs to know things, and he can know things. He can gain knowledge and increase his knowledge by using his mind, asking questions, pursuing answers, asking more questions, the whole knowledge thought process. So I do think that knowledge is completely individual, even just at the very base. Now, this is not to say that we can't exchange ideas. We're doing it right now, and that we can't learn from each other. We're doing that right now. So I still think that the individuality of knowledge and thinking holds, even if we do recognize that also we learn from people socially.
I think that overlooks our ontology, though, right? I hear this kind of a lot. This kind of, well, if you're alone on a desert island, blah blah blah, and like what a lot of those kind of models sort of overlook in my mind is motherhood. And it's not that I think at some level something that's in the air in our modern philosophy and our discussions of anthropology is this kind of Kant, Locke, Rousseau concept that the person is defined as being a rational autonomous agent. And what a lot of this overlooks is that people don't spring out of the ground. Uh, people are born out of relationships. I always thought that was very interesting and very striking, that where do people come from? Well, you don't even come from each other like aphids, where aphids asexually clone themselves over and over again. We're born sexually, and what that looks like, in the best case, is people who are in love come together, and it's out of that passion that a human being is born. And so, you and I owe our existence to relationships, not to causes, not to, well, like, in this certain sense, not to impersonal, like, causes, or like, the devil in Paradise Lost. By the end of it, he conceives of himself as having popped up out of the ground. He emerged just from nowhere. No one created him. This is part of, his descent into madness. And so that's very important, because I've been actually, we just did a series on feminism, and I've been reading a lot about, early childhood development stuff. And so much of your whole framework for the world is developed between 0 and 3, and the difference between of age, 3 years of age, and the difference between, there's striking differences when children are separated from their mothers during that age, or they are, or they're not, and they're, spoiler, they're way healthier, and they form these mental capacities and emotional capacities way better the more time they have with their mothers physically, from 0 to 3. And so nobody is really born, human beings are born so helpless. I mean, it takes years for them to be, my daughter's not weaned yet. She's almost 2, so it's like there's this fundamental dependency on these relationships, and that's just who and what we are. And so, I skipped over myself earlier. The difference between an individual as a autonomous, free, unconstrained agent, and a person, the person, the definition, there's this beautiful book called, Being as Communion. It's by the late, John Zizioulas, was an Orthodox theologian and bishop, and he said, the definition for person is a being in communion, because ontologically we come out of each other, out of these relationships. We're grown and formed in these relationships. Our conceptual models, everything is in and through relationships. Now, you can pluck a human out of that context and then throw them on a desert island, and then they need knowledge for all these sorts of things. But I don't want to skip over the part where we are just radically, and dependent is not the right word, but we're radically integrated. Dependency is part of it, but we're radically integrated for our ontology on other persons. And that's a huge part of the Orthodox understanding, and why, if you never thought about it, why the Trinity is actually so central for ancient Christianity, because it presents this vision of the person as being, I don't want to get commented at about, like, various heretical ways of talking about the Trinity, but, like, in some sense, there's a dependency, interdependency, however you want to talk about it, within the Trinity, because God the Father is supreme, but Father is a relational word. By definition, Father implies this other kind of relationship. So that God is the Father, and point, full stop. But Father within that implies these other relationships, and that's more complicated. But you get the idea. And so, like, for ancient traditional Christianity, the Trinity being at the heart of being, because of course God is the source of being, so is a relationship too. And then when God makes man in his image, that means a lot of different things. But one of the things it means is that we are in these kind of radical interdependent relationships as well. And that's what love is. That's why when John says God is love, he doesn't mean God is loving. He means that this thing, this idea of love, being both your own person, but radically connected to other persons to the point of being defined by them, while preserving your distinctiveness, these two in tension. That's what it means that God is love. That's partly what it means that man is in God's image. And so I think that anthropology, depending how you look at it, is going to radically change your epistemology, because part of the epistemology framework for these Enlightenment guys is that they are in the process of rejecting traditional Christianity. They're becoming deists, so no Trinity. They're becoming Unitarians. They're becoming atheists or whatever. And that really reframes how we do epistemology, because at some level it's, if not fully downstream from ontology and anthropology, inseparably related to it.
Yeah, so there are some things in there I agree with, and some things that I would challenge, and I'll start. And there's a lot in there again. So this is a fun conversation because you're bringing up a lot of things that connect. Um, we are born in best of circumstances from love, from a sexual relationship between two people who love each other, and when we're brought into a loving family, that's a really beautiful situation. That's the ideal. And I think a child's relationship to her mother typically is a special thing in and of itself. My wife and I were just talking about this the other day. She had read some new research on the different brain activity in a baby when the mother is holding the baby versus the father holding the baby.
Mm-hmm.
Even when they're both loving parents, like there's something there, and no surprise, evolution is real. You're going to have differences based on the way that things went down historically as we developed. So there's no question about that. And we are social animals in a certain regard. We live in society. We live among other people. You are born into a family. At the very least, you're born to a mother. So you're with another person. There's no getting around that. But I still think that it remains true, and these two things can be true at once, that we live in a society, we live in a social environment, but thinking is done by us and learning is done by us. We can be aided in the learning. We can have teachers. That's why we have the concept teacher. It's a person who can help you gain knowledge, and we need a concept for that because they're real. But it's not the case that this changes the individual nature of thinking and knowledge. Um, Now, as to your discussions about the Trinity and religion, I want to harken back for a second to Descartes and Descartes' doubt, which I think you and I would agree was arbitrary. He had no grounds for doubt. He was just making stuff up. He made up an evil demon who might be deceiving him, and that was the beginning. But this is literally the concept of arbitrary captures when you suppose something for which there is no evidence. It's just whole cloth made up. And I think that's an error. And I think that was a massive error at the beginning of modern philosophy. And we've been suffering from it ever since. But when we get to your discussion of the Trinity and of religion more generally, I would ask the same question, which is uh, where is the evidence for these things? And this is where you and I probably see eye to eye on a lot of things, but I think this is where our real differences are going to be. And this may be too much for one discussion now, so I'll plant the seeds and maybe you and I could talk again, because I'd like to read your book also and know more about where you're coming from there. I think there are three designations for any proposition that we might put forward, whether it's God exists or babies are better off with mothers or whatever you might want to say. And those are it's either true or it's false or it has no relationship to reality whatsoever because there's no evidence for it one way or the other. And that we call that arbitrary. That's what the concept of arbitrary, in my view, captures. And we need that concept because some people do put forth ideas for which there's no evidence. It's just an assertion. I actually regard the entirety of religion, the idea that there is a God and that our means of knowing him is faith or revelation and all of that, as in that category.
The
So
third category.
the arbitrary category. And so I would ask you this just to sort of get this conversation going in that direction. If you want to go there, also, you and I are both already realizing this is a very, very rich subject, and it may just be, I don't know how long we've been on. We've been on for hour 20. So I'm not sure we
Actually,
can cover.
it's just recording for 1 hour.
Oh, is that right? Okay. Oh, you're right. You're right. We started at 11 to 11:15ish. All right, then maybe we do have time for this. Um, I'll pose it to you as a question because I would do the same to Descartes if I was back there with him and he started saying, "Well, what about if we have an evil demon?" I would say, "Why do we need this hypothesis of an evil demon? You're just bringing it up, but I don't see any use value in it. I don't need it. If I look and see a cup, I believe the cup is there. If I pick it up and drink from the cup, I believe that's happening. I don't have any reason not to believe it, and there's no evidence to suggest there's an evil demon. So why would I entertain the possibility? And I would pose the same question to you about religion. Why do we need this whole hypothesis of a God? Why can't we just do without it? Because it seems arbitrary. There's no evidence to support it, at least none that I've seen. And so this is where I get really curious with someone like you, because you and I see a lot eye to eye, and we can have this conversation about, how can we know things, and what constitutes evidence, and what's the relationship of free will to these things. But then we get to this, what seems to me to be a very big jump to the idea that there's a supernatural being. And so, yeah, I'll leave it there. How would you answer, why do we need any of that?
I love this question, by the way, because this is such a paradigmatic question for what modernity is. It's such a modern question, modern post-enlightenment question. So it's so emblematic of, like, you can hit all of the themes of a modern philosophy class with just this question. So let me make a couple qualifiers, and then I'll give you an answer. So first of all, usefulness can't be our sole or primary metric for truth. Whether you say, well, how is this knowledge useful? And it's like, well, I don't know. There's lots of knowledge that isn't useful or that we find uses for it later. So usefulness, utility. If you make truth a means to some sort of utilitarian end, you're not really looking for truth anymore. So we have to disentangle that. And then when you say what evidence is there for it, I think that really assumes a certain kind of, obviously, empirical standard for evidence. Historically, that has assumed materialism. And those kinds of questions are unanswerable because they become category errors. You say, okay, well, what can we do in a lab that proves God exists? And the answer is you can't, because that's a category error, and not because God doesn't exist. And we'll get to why that is. So keeping those two methodological points in mind, I'll give you my answer, and you can push back on any part of it that you like. So here's a very broad, big picture answer. So by the way, my first love was science, actually, before I got into philosophy and theology, and before I decided I didn't want to make money. I
I
and I was
resemble that point. Yes.
yes. But you got to do what you love. So I love science, and I love the scientific method, and something that's constantly distressing to me all of the time when I have scientific conversations, sometimes with other people, how little scientific spirit so many people have. So why am I saying this? Here's the example. When you look at the whole history of humanity, as far as we have generally manuscript evidence, obviously, but lots of archaeological evidence and so forth, every human culture, almost throughout all of time and space, cultures that had no contact with each other whatsoever, have more or less come to the same general conclusions about metaphysics. Spirits exist. They need to be propitiated. The soul exists. And God exists, understood in the sense, not in an explicitly Christian sense, obviously that's a later development, but in the sense that there is some sort of a supreme uncaused cause, unmoved mover. That's what Aristotle calls it. I call it the arche in my book, so you might enjoy that part. And so, as you probably know, people like Marcus Aurelius, ancient Stoics, all these ancient Greeks believed in the pantheon of the gods, but they also believed in something that was higher than them, that was the uncaused cause. They often called it Hatheos, the god, or Deus, whatever. So it's like, these are, and this is true across time and space, across cultures that had no contact with each other. And so then there's this one culture that comes along, and very late in human history, that's existed for only a very small period of time, this kind of post-Enlightenment European rationalist materialist culture, whatever you want to call it. And it says, we're going to throw out all of that because we know better. And so just from a very basic scientific level, the ask to dismiss these things unless they can justify themselves, because that's how you're framing the burden of proof. You're saying, until we have evidence for this, we shouldn't believe all of any of this. We need a positive demonstration of why we should have these beliefs before we should adopt them. And that is, you could simply do the opposite, right? The innocent until proven guilty, or the guilty until proven innocent. And until very recently in human history, only one culture ever said, well, there isn't a use case for these, there isn't evidence, so we're gonna withhold judgment until we have these things proven to us in some way. And you said you're not a materialist. That's great. But a lot of the guys who came up with this type of epistemic structure that you're outlining were materialists, and that's the basis on which they did that. And so, first argument is, it seems unscientific to me to take the 99% of human history and art and culture and music and mythology and literature and storytelling and saying all of this needs to justify itself in the face of this new methodology by the 1% of human existence, and on the basis that we know better. And that doesn't prove anything. I'm aware that doesn't prove anything, but I'm not therefore saying therefore God exists. I'm saying therefore our epistemic framework, the way we frame the burden of proof and the way that we frame our initial credibility kind of assessment of the matter, shouldn't be so dismissive. That's all I'm arguing for. We can't be as dismissive as you're offering when you frame the burden of proof this way, in my view, because there's a massive amount of evidence that all these cultures believed in these things. So as a scientist, I'm much more, putting my scientist hat on, I'm not a scientist, but putting my scientist hat on, I'm much more inclined to say, well, maybe there's something wrong with our thinking that needs to be taken a little more seriously. And then one little quick addition to that, to give you an example on the evidence business, is, and this obviously opens up a big can of worms, but morality. So here's another thing that cannot be demonstrated in a laboratory setting, which is, what is the good? And I don't know if, was it William Lane Craig? It was one of those types of guys who said, we know that the moral reality exists the same way we know that the physical morality or the physical reality exists, because when we try to act in the world, we run into it. And so that'd be the example that I would give, more than the example of God specifically. It's like every single culture in human history has developed this sense that there is an external moral world that we ought to conform to, and that this is the good. That's a very specific belief, actually. And before you say, oh, well, it's evolutionary, I don't think you need that belief to evolve correctly. And Alvin Plantinga has made some good arguments about that, if you want to get into that. But I'm going to stop. That's a lot. And I'm going to, does that kind of framing make sense, though?
It helps because I now understand more about where you're coming from on this. I would say this of of the fact that throughout history, cultures and people have believed in God or gods. Um, this is largely explained by the God of the gaps idea. As we started to understand more and more about nature, we just eliminated the gods that we had assumed previously were causing things. So, volcanoes erupt and you attribute it to a god until you understand plate tectonics and how volcanoes actually function. Poseidon, we don't believe in Poseidon anymore because we know what causes waves and we know what causes tides and we know what causes things. So I don't think looking back at the history of human beings and saying, well, look, the cultures have always believed in God, so that's a good reason to believe in it. I mean, cultures had always believed in slavery until fairly recently, and that's certainly not a good argument for slavery. But the idea of God is not merely arbitrary in the sense that there's no evidence for him, in my view. It also, in my view, contradicts what we know to be true, because I don't know how you define God, but if you define God the way that Jewish, Christian, and Muslim people typically define God, which is the creator of the universe, all, the all-knowing, all-powerful, all-good, maker of moral truth and everything.
And can I just say that's
Sure.
basically how I mean, you add the ancient Greco-Roman world, like that's how anyone who conceived of this idea of the uncaused cause, they all thought of it that way. But go on.
Yeah, but it's not, it doesn't comport with the knowledge that we have about the world. So, and the easiest way to see this is to think in terms of what God is supposed to be able to do. Um, he's supposed to be able to enact miracles. Well, a miracle is when a thing happens that can't happen, right? When a thing acts in contradiction to its nature. A woman turns into a pillar of salt. A stick turns into a snake speaks, a virgin gives birth, and the like. And these don't make sense to, in my view, to a rational mind who says, look, the fundamental laws of the universe are the laws of identity and causality. Things are what they are, and they act in accordance with their natures. Everything has a nature, everything has an identity, and it has characteristics that enable it to act a certain way. A woman can become a CEO, but she can't become a pillar of salt. So to my mind, it's not just an arbitrary assertion that there's a God who does these things and a God who is unlimited, which by the in its own, just that definition, unlimited means he's not limited by anything, which throughout the history of religion and debates about religion has been attacked from multiple angles. Like if he's not limited, can he, it gets all the way down to silly stuff like, can he make a stone he can't move and all of that. But it's also the case that unlimited is definition by negatives rather than positive. So if you tell me his positive characteristics, there's no there that I've ever heard. Now I'm not imputing to you that you would not say there's a there, but I grew up in a Christian family with a minister father, and I've just never heard anyone give a description of God that doesn't contradict what we know to be true, or that is not so vague as to be meaningless. Or they'd take the Spinoza route and just say, well, by God, I mean nature, in which case we're multiplying concepts beyond necessity. We don't need the concept God. We already have the concept nature. So this is a fire hose of stuff, and I don't mean to assault you with just all of this, but this is why, to my mind, it just doesn't hold any water. And it not only doesn't hold water, it just seems to contradict everything that I know to be true. On top of which, I don't see any need for the hypothesis. And then the last thing I'll say, because you hit on this, and I think this is also important, I regard the factual basis for an idea as essentially the same thing as the use value of the idea. They're just looked at from different perspectives. So I don't think there's anything wrong with saying, well, what's the use value of this idea? Because here's the thing, and we can go to morality. If I say, do we need morality? And if so, why? And somebody says, well, you're asking for the use value of this thing. Aren't you committing an error? I would say, no, I'm not committing an error. I'm asking for objectivity, because I could phrase the same question this way. Either there are facts of reality that give rise to morality and the need of morality, or there are not. If there are, then those facts, if we can identify them, constitute objectivity. Identification of facts is what objectivity is. So asking the question, what is morality? Do we need it? If so, why? Which is how Ayn Rand approached it. Or more granularly, what are values? Do we need them? If so, why? And as soon as you start asking those questions, your mind starts going, well, what facts give rise to the need of values or the concept of value? And so that factual basis and the use value are the same thing looked at from two different perspectives. And when they come together, when there is factual basis for something and there's use value, especially when we're talking about anything in the normative realm, normative in epistemology. We should think this way, or we should regard this as evidence and not that. All of that, I think the use value and the factual basis are the same thing. And I know this is, again, a lot, but I think this all pertains to the discussion we're having, because if we're going to talk about God, or if we're going to talk about whether we should accept God, or whether we should accept the methodologies that Christians use to assume that there's a God, I think it is relevant to say, why do we need any of this? Are there facts that give rise to the need of it or not? And if there aren't, then to my mind, the whole thing is just a floating abstraction that I can just throw to the wayside and say, I don't need it. Now, this is not to, I'll say one more thing. This is not to say that there's nothing that has happened in the history of Christendom, in the sense that there were a lot of Christians. I mean, John Locke was Christian, and he developed the theory of rights that made the United States possible. So, he's a great guy, one of my great heroes in philosophy. I love the man. I just disagree with him that God is the reason we have property rights. I don't have property because God owns me, and therefore you can't use me because I'm God's business to use. I have property rights for the other reason that Locke pointed out in his second treatise on government, and that is that if I dig something out of the ground, or shoot a deer or whatever, if I convert nature into a value, I own that value by virtue of the fact that I converted it into a value. So I just don't see a need for any of these hypotheses in the religious sphere to understand where morality comes from, how to know what's good and bad. I think we can know all of that, and that we can go that way if you want to talk that way. So again, I just don't see the need for the hypothesis.
We're not going to cover all these topics in the next 40
Yeah.
minutes, as you know.
Imagine that. Yeah.
Imagine that. Happy to come back on. But let me try to, because I've been taking copious notes while you're talking here. And what I'm trying to do is get at some of the heart points of these questions, and then frame them in a way that allows us to make some reasonable progress in the next half hour. So let me think here what the best, because I'm just gonna not address some of those, but there are a few, I think, easy low-hanging fruit parts of your rejoinder there. So I guess what I would say is that I'm not necessarily arguing for God in any particular manifestation yet. That's a much later kind of, okay, well, why this God of this religion sort of thing, and or even why God in the sort of modern post-Christian kind of imagination either. I'm just talking about the idea of religion at all, and the need for religion as sort of inseparable from morality. Those aren't Christian concepts. Those aren't Judeo-Christian concepts or Muslim concepts or whatever. They're universal human concepts through all of human history, through cultures that are radically different: Hinduism, Japanese Shintoism, etc. The idea that there is a spiritual dimension to the world, that there's something called the good, that there's almost certainly an uncaused cause. It's hard for me to call those religious claims, because they're really human claims. If you did a sample of all human beliefs and kind of squished them together, that's basically what you'd get. So let me say a few things just about the methodology that you're employing here. One is that the way you're framing these questions, I feel like I have to say this, it's extremely modern. It's extremely bounded to a very specific set of Western European thinkers. And there are mistakes in these because of the way that those characters make mistakes. And so one of them is this God of the gaps idea. This is just a total fantasy of the new atheist type of person. We have to get away from this God of the gaps kind of conversation, because it doesn't bear out any historically at all. I know that happens in the new atheist versus evangelical context, where and especially in the post-Darwin context, where Darwinism was propped up culturally to say, see, we don't need God to explain this feature of biology and whatever. But this is just not how ancient people thought about this at all. It doesn't, the God of the gaps thing works for, like, in 19th century evangelicals. It works on them. It does not work on Aristotle. It does not work on Socrates. It does not work on Marcus Aurelius or Thales or Epictetus or Pythagoras or any of the great intellectual people of the world, because they did not explain God as a gap filling hypothesis or any a part of their religious elements. I mean, they were all deeply religious. We love Pythagoras. We love the Pythagorean theorem. Pythagoras was the leader of a religious cult. They were all deeply religious because they understood that morality had some intrinsic connection to the world. They all believed in the gods. You can't tell me Aristotle was dumb or that he was merely involved in gap filling. I mean, that's ridiculous. None of these guys were like that. Yet they all believed that, based on pure logical evidence, not evidence, let's dismiss empiricism for a second. Based on logical necessity, there had to be an uncaused cost and an unmoved mover. That's a huge value that the God hypothesis. Let's dismiss all the Christian trappings for a minute. Like, when you sit there with Aristotle, excuse me, or with Thomas Aquinas, who I'm not a huge fan of, but nevertheless, the medieval inheritance of the classical thinkers, when you sit there with them and you actually read the primaries and you read how they arrive at the conclusion that there is an uncaused cause or an unmoved mover, there isn't manuscript evidence where they're sitting around going, well, we just don't know how anything happened, so it must be some big spirit in the sky. This is a common myth. It's not in the manuscript evidence. What's actually in the manuscript evidence? The most rigorous causal reasoning you have ever seen in your life comes out of, for example, medieval Christendom. I read these guys in manuscript form, which was horribly brutal, and I got out of that pretty quickly. But I did read them in manuscript form in grad school, and I was just floored by how thoroughly rational they were. Like, systematic rationality came from these people. So ancient, it is, all this is to say, I'm getting a little impassioned here, but this idea of the God of the gaps is a popular modern myth. It does not bear up to reading the primary sources of the greatest thinkers in human history. They don't employ that kind of reasoning whatsoever. And so they lead to these kind of use cases where, like, yeah, there has to be an uncaused cause. There has to be an unmoved mover. Nothing in the universe can create itself. The universe couldn't cause itself because it'd have to exist prior to itself, yada, yada, yada. You personally may differ with those conclusions. That's not what I'm talking about. I'm just talking about how we characterize these thinkers. I hope that part makes sense. And then I might be done. Let me just check real quick, because that's probably enough. God hypothesis contradicts knowledge about the world. That's the other thing. It's the same kind of thing. That's a category error. So no, I know there are a lot of, how shall we say, logically embarrassing holders of theism. I know that that's true. I've been around a lot of them. I appreciate your critiques of that. But when you read serious Christian thinkers throughout history and serious Greco-Roman pagan thinkers throughout history, the concept of an uncaused cause, an unmoved mover, or something that's the source of morality, uh, that's what I'm talking about. Those things don't contradict our knowledge of the world. They're actually, even if you disagree with them, you have to see their function, which is as rational, meaty ways to ground very important questions like morality and cosmology. Does that kind of
Yeah,
make sense?
look, there was I and you and everyone in the modern world gets to stand on the shoulders of giants and to have the knowledge that we have today. Then I can't go back and shake a stick at Aristotle, for God's sake, because he doesn't know what I learned from philosophers like Ayn Rand, who just came into existence, 100 years ago. So I'm not saying that no one ever had any good reasons for believing in something like an uncaused cause, or an uncaused mover, or the being who created the universe, or any of that. what I'm saying is that over time, as human knowledge developed by individuals who then shared it socially with others, to get back to our earlier points, I mean, we've built a huge amount of knowledge, a huge structure of genuine knowledge. And um, in each of these instances where we discovered something about how the universe works or how entities act and interact in the universe that ticked off one of the things we used to attribute to God, we would then no longer regard a God as being the one who was responsible for that. I don't think calling that the God of the gaps is illegitimate, and it doesn't matter that, you know, Aristotle and others didn't talk about the God of the gaps or that Christians didn't talk about it. It's a modern day term or phrase that we can use, I think, fruitfully to say, look, we can see something that happened throughout history. It's just the case that as human beings discovered more things about science, they said, oh, we don't need to attribute that to a god anymore. We can say that we know how this happened. I mean, something like an eclipse, for God's sake. Imagine being a caveman and watching an eclipse. You have no way of understanding what is going on. Of course, you're going to attribute that to some kind of a higher power or some magical thing. But as we
Aristotle knew how eclipses worked.
okay, but I said caveman, so I'm going all the way back, and I also don't know the history of who knew what when about eclipses. But my point holds, which is that when you when you learn new things that you used to attribute to a god, you no longer attribute it to a god. You just attribute it to a natural cause. Um, the other thing I would say that
If I may, I'm sorry.
sure, you go ahead,
I really want to press on this because these are broad
please.
brushstrokes.
Yeah, go ahead.
I don't see any evidence for that historically. Because the people who were some of the most rational people in the history of the human race were the medieval Christians who invented the university system. And when we see them doing experiments, nothing changes about their theism. The more they do experiments, the more they do geometry. The medieval theologians invented new forms of logic that we have today because of them. All of these logical rules you've said, law of excluded middle, all this kind of stuff. Those laws were made by people who believed in an uncaused cost. And on the basis that the universe was the product of a single rational mind is what caused medieval European man and the ancient man too to decide, hey, let's investigate the universe. Let's do science. I mean, the Catholic Church invented science. This is an uncomfortable narrative for lots of people. But like just the history of thinking is that all of these technological and logical and rationalist developments were caused by medieval Christians who did not go, oh, we learned this about how eclipses work. I guess we're going to stop believing in God. Like, I just don't see any historical evidence for that. It's often said, it's often repeated, but I now challenge everybody to show me a manuscript evidence where that happens because I don't see that happening.
So I think that who's the guy who wrote the book Dominion? Um,
Oh, the recent
yeah, it's escaping me right now. But anyway, it'll come to me in a minute. So the thesis here that I think you're tapping into is the idea that look,
Tom Holland.
Tom Holland, exactly. I should remember that because people get him confused with the actor. Um, the thesis here is that, and there's some truth to this. Look, in a dominantly Christian world, all of the scientists and thinkers were Christians. And so what they discovered and developed, whether you're talking about Newton or Galileo or whomever, what they discovered was some were facts about reality, but they may have had Christian elements or been fully Christian. I don't know the history of all of these thinkers. It's not my area. But let's say someone's fully Christian and he comes up with some scientific facts. This certainly happened repeatedly throughout history. But the question is his Christianity and his acceptance of faith as a means of knowledge, which is what I think faith ultimately is claimed to be as a means of knowledge, or is that the reason that he discovered the scientific discovery, or is it the case that he put his reasoning mind to work in the natural world and figured something out? And I think it's the latter in every case. I don't know of any. I mean, maybe you could point to one where somebody's, intuition, or not intuition, revelation or faith is the thing that delivered the scientific knowledge. I just don't think that that is a thing. So I don't. The fact that science developed within a Christian world doesn't mean that Christianity is the cause of science. And I think that's it's just a false way to view the causal relationship there.
I
Um,
don't think so. Let me give you an
okay,
example. I'm
go
really
ahead.
excited to give you an
Sure.
example because you have to ask yourself, why didn't certain cultures develop along certain lines? And it's back to this conceptual framing, like you said at the beginning. How do people think about the world? So good. The example I always give people, my readers are tired of me saying this. We have manuscript evidence that the ancient Greeks developed steam technology. It's very strange. Like, and then you sit there and think about it, and you're like, there's no real reason they couldn't have taken that and advanced steam technology. And there's no real reason the Romans couldn't have achieved a higher tech level than they did. Why didn't they do this? There's two reasons. One is that, and this is back to the conceptual framing. One is that the they had slaves, as you pointed out. All of Athens was built on the back of a slave economy. And so Aristotle and the boys who were the intellectual class, they didn't do any of the manual labor. And they came up with they came up with this concept for steam engine stuff. And they're like, haha. And then it was just a curio to them. They didn't think like we would have thought, oh my gosh, we're going to use this as a new labor saving device. They had no interest in labor saving because they had slaves. They didn't care. The second thing is that the ancient pagans thought that the world was under the dominion of the gods. And if you messed with it too much, you were going to get smited. We all know the story of Icarus and Daedalus. That was very baked into their imaginations that nature belonged to the gods and it's not man's right to take over and force the world into the shape that he wants it to be in. Those two things are a very strong argument that imaginative framework prevented the ancient pagans from developing the kind of technology that we would. What changed with Christendom? Two things. Christ said that everyone, no matter slave nor free, was one in Christ Jesus. So the first sort of fomenting of the concept of human rights really is introduced into the Greco-Roman world by Christianity, which leads to a massive breakdown in the concept of the institution of slavery, and then leads to the development of labor-saving technologies in a way that really was unprecedented in human history. So Christianity leads to this by weakening the institution of slavery. The second thing is that when the Christianity that Christ conquered the fallen gods and ushered in a new age of man's glorification, and it's only after that European man is able to conceive of a world in which he's free to go into nature and investigate it without fear of being smited by the gods. And because in the early Christian imagination, they actually believed in Zeus and Thor and all those guys. They just viewed them as fallen angels, if you didn't know that. So actually, I mean, the massive growth that we see in technology, in logic, in the invention of the university system, in massive widespread literacy, all of these things come because medieval or Western European man had his paradigm changed about the world by Christianity. And so it's not just incidental that these guys happen to be Christian. It's the fact that they were doing science at all in a way that we would recognize it in modernity is due to a radical Christian transformation of the European imagination.
There are some elements in there I would agree with, and I think that are supported. First of all, I think that Christianity as a religion, distinct from Judaism at the time, did with especially with the idea that the individual's life matters and that he can achieve, salvation, was the beginnings of a concept of individualism. It certainly was not the concept of rights, which is why rights is mentioned nowhere in the Bible, and that the eradication of slavery didn't happen in the Christian world until Christianity had largely been defanged. And it took almost 2,000 years for Christians to finally go, hey, maybe we shouldn't enslave people. Maybe, and the people who did that, although many of them were Christians, weren't doing it on the basis of Christian scripture. They were doing it on the basis of Enlightenment ideas that were not based in Christian scripture, Enlightenment ideas about the fact that human beings have this capacity of reason that had been demonstrated by various scientists, and that they were starting to realize that reasoning and thinking and knowledge and the human soul are individual elements of beings, and that blacks and others have those same characteristics. So I don't think you can attribute any of that to Christianity. And
Name me
we'll have
one pre-Christian source in the ancient world that said anything close to St. Paul saying there is neither male nor female, Jew nor Greek, slave nor free, but all are one in Christ Jesus. This is an unprecedented statement in Western history.
I will not deny that that has some effect. Again, I say of Christianity that it is the first religion that had some degree of individualism baked into it, and I think that's a good thing. But it also holds that you should have faith in the existence of a being for whom there is no evidence. And I know some people say, well, there is evidence. We could have those kinds of debates, but I don't see any evidence.
Where does that belief come from? Cite me somebody in Christendom or in the Bible who said you should believe in something for which there's no evidence.
So here, it's not that people put it that way. It's that that is the only way that you can accept the existence of God. There simply is no evidence for a supernatural being. If there were evidence, that would be something in nature that we'd see and go, oh, look, there's that, which means God would just be another thing in nature. The idea
Again,
of God,
all human beings for all of human history found this concept remarkably intuitive, and not because they were dumb. That's
again,
very strange.
for all human history also held that slavery was just fine, and in many cultures that cutting the hearts out of babies and holding them up to the gods to curry favor with the gods were fine. I mean, you can't say because people held these ideas for a long time that the ideas have some truth. Truth is not correspondence to ancient ideas. Truth is correspondence to reality when there is evidence to support the idea in question. And we just don't have evidence to support the existence of God. So if somebody
If you
has
define it by empiricism, yeah. But I think that begs the question.
All right. Well, I'm not an empiricist in the Humean sense, where I think knowledge begins and ends with sensory data. I am an empiricist in the objectivist sense, in the Aristotelian sense, where I think that knowledge begins with sensory data, and that we can form abstractions and make connections, and including very abstract connections such as the laws of causality and the law of identity. And if the laws of causality and identity hold, then things like a woman turning into a pillar of salt just can't happen. So again, we get to where if you're not going to accept ideas in the absence of evidence, and ideas that contradict what we know to be true, then you can't accept religion. You have to accept it on faith. And so you asked earlier, who says that you have to accept these ideas on faith? It's de facto the case that you have to accept them on faith, because there's no other. You can't accept that three beings who allegedly are simultaneously not the same thing are also the same thing, unless you say, I'm going to drop the law of identity as my guiding factor in my thought processes.
No, so that's actually the exact thing that caused a massive advance in propositional logic in the medieval era, was actually to be able to make finer, because logic at the time did not have the capacity to make fine enough distinctions to talk about the Trinity, and the medieval intellectual giants drove the creation of new logic precisely for Trinitarian theology. It was a massively rational movement,
What is
highly
the principle?
evidence-based.
What specifically is that principle by reference to which 3 can equal 1?
We don't have 15 minutes for me to give you the Trinitarian thing, because in order for me to answer that question, I'd have to reframe most of your categories, because a lot of what you've done is you've taken a post-Enlightenment epistemology and projected your meanings onto people in the past without reference to the primary sources. I have to insist on this. These thinkers that you're accusing of having a faith in the absence of evidence paradigm did not think this way. This is a modern myth that we project onto the past because of our historical biases. We think we know everything. When you read the primary sources, they do not think like this. And you said, I'm a empiricist in the Aristotelian sense. Aristotle argued for the existence of an uncaused cause and an unknown mover as logically necessary to conceive of the universe. You're talking about a pillar of salt. We can talk about Christianity later. I'm not talking about Christianity. I'm just talking about very basic philosophical things that all of the greatest rational minds in human history agreed with, which is that the universe couldn't cause itself.
Well, so let's pause on that for a second. That sounded like an argument from authority, and I don't think you're making that. So but
I
just for the
know.
record, the way you put that, it sounds like, these really smart people couldn't have been wrong. I would never go there. And you're a teacher, and you certainly don't teach your students to think that way. Here's the thing about the uncaused, the prime mover in Aristotle's terms. Aristotle was under the impression that in order for motion to begin in the universe, something had to cause that motion. And I think he was doing mental machinations to the effect that, everything that happens is caused by some prior event or some prior thing. But I think this is a false view of the law of causality that Aristotle was under. And again, I'm not shaking a finger at Aristotle. None of us would be here if it wasn't for Aristotle. So this is not any kind of you should have known better, Aristotle. Not only did you invent logic and biology and several other sciences, but you should have gotten this one right too. I'm not saying that. But here's the thing. I regard, and I think it only makes sense to regard, the universe as eternal, which means outside of time. Time is the measurement of motion of objects in the universe. That's exactly, when the Earth travels around the sun in a certain period, and we call that a year. And that measurement of that happening is what time means. And the universe doesn't exist in time. Time exists in the universe. So that's the first thing I'd say there. Secondly, that to exist is to have an identity. So everything in the universe, including the universe itself, has an identity. And things act, the items in the universe, the various things in the universe, they act in accordance with their identity. So you don't need an initial cause of motion because entities, being what they are, have always acted as they must, given the entity's nature. You don't need a first cause because the law of causality, in my view, properly understood, does not mean that something happened before that caused the next thing to happen. Rather, it means things that exist act in accordance with their natures or their identities. And I think this is the answer to Aristotle's uncaused mover or prime mover. So in this and the other instances that you've mentioned, I think there are answers to all of these things. I don't think they're obvious. I don't claim to know all of the answers, but I think it's an argument from ignorance in the literal sense of that term to say that, for instance, let's say I didn't have some explanation for Aristotle's error there. If someone says to me, aha, well, you can't answer how motion began, and therefore it must have been caused by God. Now, that doesn't make any sense. That's illogical. It's called the argument from ignorance because it's treating ignorance, my ignorance of how that happened or what would have caused it, as evidence for the existence of God. But of course, ignorance is not evidence. Ignorance and evidence are two completely different things. And it's illogical to treat them as the same thing. So, and I actually think the argument from ignorance is the fundamental error involved in literally all of the arguments for God. Because in every instance, someone is going to say, such and such happens or happened. You can't explain why it happened. And so I'm going to say that's evidence for God. Now, that's the form of the argument. Nobody ever puts it that bluntly. But I think that's the form of the argument. And so here again, I just think that the religious arguments for God don't hold water. And I also think they actually contradict what we know to be true. Last thing I'll say, and then I'll shut up for a minute. I also think that it is completely possible in this world with as much as is pushed into our heads when we're kids. I was raised in a religious household. I know the program. I never shake a finger at someone and say you're bad for believing these ideas. These philosophy is hard, and philosophy and religion and the discussions that people have around these subjects, they're difficult. They're difficult even for super wicked, freak geniuses, let alone we regular people. And so I never hold anyone in contempt for believing something that he thinks he has good reason to believe.
Hmm.
That doesn't mean that I'm not going to, attack the arguments and try to figure out what's true there. And I think that's what we're doing here. But I always like to, I know you have young followers and I have young followers on these things. And I always like to remind anyone watching these things that the proper business of a philosopher is not to beat up on people or condemn people for not agreeing with his ideas, but rather to say, I'm trying to figure out what makes sense. And I
Yeah,
advocate that others do that too. Anyway, that
of
was just
course,
more
of course.
PSA along the way here.
Yeah, yeah. People, you can be very critical of ideas and not of the people who hold them, and that's not everybody realizes that. No, well said. I should apologize for misrepresenting myself a little bit here. When I brought up some of these things, you've sat down and gone down the path for each of the things that I brought up, like Aristotle and cause and all of that stuff. I'm not at this time, I should have been clear about this. I'm not at this time arguing for or against God or for any of these specific propositions. What I was arguing against is a couple like housekeeping parts of methodology, because obviously each of these is a whole conversation to have. I was just trying to do a very top level analysis where my argument was we should drop the God of the gaps hypothesis for an explanation of religion. That was my argument. And that's why I brought up the authorities, not because I'm doing the appeal to authority, as you guessed, but because the God of the gaps hypothesis isn't borne out by any of the primary sources. And when you have some of the smartest people who have ever lived holding these positions, like Aristotle, that I think is a very strong point against a God of the gaps thesis for the existence of religion. I don't think religion can, like I could be an atheist and make this argument. I'm arguing that the existence of religion can't adequately be explained by this God of the gaps thing on the basis that all of these highly intellectual people, A, didn't phrase it that way, and B, none of these people said, again, like none of these people said, well, faith means belief without evidence. That's an atheist definition maybe of, or a post-Christian definition of something that just isn't borne out in the primary sources. That was the only argument that I was
Got
making
it.
right
Got it.
now.
Got it. Yeah. And I think that there are, I think, correct me if I'm wrong, and you know a lot of religious people and are one yourself. I mean, I think one of the main reasons that people take an interest in and accept religion is perfectly understandable in a sense. First of all, they think that in order for morality to exist, it's got to come from God or it's not objective. And that's captured in the common phrase, if there is no God, anything goes. And
Dostoevsky,
I
yeah.
know, yeah, and a lot of people hold that view and they're like, well, I don't want to live in a world where anything goes. That sounds like a nightmare, and it would be a nightmare. So I understand that. I also think a lot of people have accepted the idea that purpose and meaning come from God. And they've certainly been told that since they were young, if they're in a religious household. I was under that impression, and certainly told that as I was a kid for a while. So I get all of that. I think there are answers to all of these issues. I think we can get morality from reality, and in fact, through observation and logic. And I think, in fact, that the existence of a God, which I deny it is a thing, but if God did exist, he'd make morality impossible, because it would mean that he's going to give us commandments that we have to follow or go to hell. And that's the opposite of morality. Morality is a code of values to guide your choices and actions, and your choices and actions, given your nature, should be derived from the requirements of your existence as the kind of being you are. So I think that there's a contradiction there in trying to get morality from God. And I also think that purposes and meaning have to come from individual minds and reasons about human needs, because those are the facts that give rise to the need of the concept of purpose. My purpose today is to get this article written and off to the publisher. Where'd that come from? It didn't come from God. It came from me, and it came from my needs in this world. Or my purpose in going out tonight is to see if that girl shows up again because I want to ask her to dance at the bar or whatever. These are purposes in my view, and they're secular. They're natural. They're just parts of living. So I know we're opening we're both you you and I are opening cans of worms galore here at the end, and I'm aware of that, and I know you are. Um, Let me do this. Let me give you the last few minutes here to say whatever's on your mind, because I'm sure you have something, and then let's talk again. You're fun to talk to because you're calm and you don't get, some people in these kinds of conversations start, hurling, insults and stuff, and that's no fun. But this has been very nice, and I'd love to chat with you more. So let's plan to do that if you're open.
Oh yeah, sure. No, I'm glad. I get a little. I'm Italian, so I get very. I don't know. In my family, people talk over each other. That's
Oh, I
kind
don't
of.
mind chutzpah and passion.
Yeah.
That's all
Yes.
fun. Yeah, yeah.
Yes. Yes. The only thing I have time for at this point is a generalization. So, um, I want to. It's so difficult to both be honest in a lot of these kinds of contexts and also not come off as condescending, which I don't want to be. You're clearly a person who is deeply committed to reason and to calmly walking through arguments, which is rarer and rarer and very refreshing. And you know, sometimes you argue with people in life. My dad would tell me this. He said, you really have to assess when you're talking to somebody and you're arguing about some issue. Is this person really open to thinking about something and listening and having an actual conversation, or does this person just want to yell at you? And he said, you have that's for him, that was always like the step zero of having conversation. And so when you're in a situation where there is a real conversation happening, then you have to kind of go out on a limb and risk some honesty. And so this is, I guess, my encouragement to you would be, as we've talked, a lot of the things that you've said about religion and Christianity just don't I don't see that anywhere. And I'm steeped in primary sources from this is what we do on my show. If you've listened to my show, I always say, it's basically just growing up reading, right? But we just read the primary sources because, don't take my word for it. What do I know? And so in Shintoism, in Buddhism, in Judaism, in Christianity, and all throughout the history of Christianity and ancient pagans, I mean, there are a lot of myths that people have about religion and God and the people who believe those things. And I heard all of that from a lot of my skeptic friends when I was younger. And then I read the primaries and I realized none of that was in there. And so my concern is that a lot of the concerns you have about religion, I share, because that's not what traditional, and this is why I became Eastern Orthodox, is because I discovered that traditional apostolic Christianity had almost nothing to do with a lot of these modern Christian constructs that I had encountered. So at the end, you said, this is a good example. You said, if God existed, that would destroy morality because he says we need to do these things or we're going to go to hell. I don't believe in that God. That's not the God of Orthodox Christianity. And yeah, the God of, like who picks one side of the Euthyphro dilemma, where it's good because God says it's good. It's like, obviously that undermines morality and makes it arbitrary. But again, Plato had figured this out a long time ago. And medieval Christians and Byzantine thinkers, I mean, they knew that. They had read Euthyphro and they don't conceive of God that way. And so one of the things that I notice with a lot of modern atheists is that they have a lot of arguments that are specifically aimed at a certain type of, usually evangelical or what would be called fundamentalist Christianity. And I'm right there with you, because those sort of fundamentalist Christians they don't believe in the same conception of, or have the same definition for faith, belief without evidence. No historic Christians really believed that, that God was this arbitrary decider of what is and what that. We don't believe that either. I mean, it's just, so I'm happy to engage with those criticisms with you. But what I want to offer you is like, actually reading the primary sources was super exciting, because I discovered that they just didn't think like any of that. And that the Christianity that I grew up around, frankly, I grew up around a lot of wonderful people. Like you said, the people were wonderful, but the concept, the conceptual content of that religion was basically bogus and had almost nothing to do with historic Christianity.
So I can't help but just get one point in here, and then so I'm still going to give you the last point, but I have to address something here.
Sure.
So I don't think it's true that no religious people have treated faith as a means of knowledge. I wrote an article titled "Reason versus Mysticism: Choice and Consequences," and in that I quote several very famous religious people, including Abram Joshua Heschel, Calvin, Aquinas, and a few others. A Muslim guy whose name I can't remember right now, to the effect that faith is acceptance of ideas in the absence of evidence. Now, they say it in not exactly that terse a way, but they nevertheless make the point in various ways. So I do think that that's part of it. And my fundamental with religion, because I don't care whether someone believes in hell or not, that's not my thing is, are you treating faith as a means of knowledge? Are you saying that you can know things by means of non-evidential methods that don't involve evidence or reason? I dispute that you can, and I think that religious people hold that you can, and that's sort of the difference. Now, you may be a religious person who disagrees and says no, faith is not a means of knowledge in any way, shape, or form. Usually, people will put it in terms of, well, no, faith means trust in God. And then if you say, well, what do you mean by trust in God? You mean trust in God's existence, or trust that He's going to do what He's told you? Because first, He has to exist before you could trust that He's going to do what He said. And then they said, no, trust in His existence too. And I said, well, by trust in His existence, do you mean trust that He exists? And by trust, do you mean that you know He exists, or just that you're kind of think He might exist? And if you keep going, if you keep pulling the thread, what you get at is that they do mean that they can know that God exists by means of faith. And that's why I think that it really is kind of a pervasive view that's not often stated directly. I'd love your thoughts on that. I wanted to get that in because I didn't want you to think that I had no knowledge of historical bases for this idea, or that it's just not out there at all. In my article, I have citations about it galore. And then I'm curious about your point here. And I'll put it this way. I could put it this way to a Rabbi David Walpe once when I was in a debate with him. If you would say that faith, the definition of faith is not that it is acceptance of ideas in the absence of evidence, would you state strongly and unequivocally that faith is not a means of knowledge? That you cannot know things, you cannot know anything by means of faith?
There's a very clever argument that you've set up.
And I don't mean to put it, so feel free to take your time on this. And again, I do want to talk to you again. It's hard at the end of a conversation like this because it's so rich. So I'm not trying to put you on the spot. And if you would rather say I would rather discuss this at another time, that's fine. Also, you can take another 15 minutes to answer this, whatever you prefer.
Well, I mean, we'll have to follow up on it. That's just the nature of the situation. But in saying something that doesn't invite the follow-up to occur right now, I was starting to say that's a very clever argument, but my issue with it is that, so you said you have Calvin and Thomas Aquinas in there. I mean, these are Western Christians, and Eastern Orthodoxy has a lot of difficulty not just talking to atheists. Actually, I think it's easier a little bit, but talking to Western Christians, to Catholics and Protestants a lot of the time, because the all of the vocabulary and the conceptual framework, like I mentioned, that the post-Christian Enlightenment atheist types use was developed and built, and that Protestants use too. Those categories like faith, categories like reason, categories like subject and object, all those categories were first framed and articulated by medieval Catholic thinkers. And so whether or not anyone likes it, and atheists and Protestants tend not to like it, the Western conceptual language toolbox is Catholic fundamentally. And so all of those groups, Catholic, Protestants, and atheists, can have a conversation about these terms in which they're all more or less using them in similar ways. Whereas it's very difficult for Eastern Orthodoxy to have those kinds of conversations quickly at face value, because Orthodoxy's conceptual framework, which is quite rigorous in terms of rationality and logic, just developed in a totally different vocabulary set using Greek instead of Latin, differences like that. And so in order for me to answer a question like that, I can't give an answer within your binaries. People always think this is a cop-out, but the reality is that, like, I have to redefine a bunch of those terms into a total structure that makes sense within Orthodoxy. So, like, you know, faith especially is like the most problematic term in there, because there's like 3 or 4 different things that we talk about, and none of them can be put completely under the umbrella of this word faith. So it's very different conceptual framework. You may want to, if you want to have me back on, you may want to flip through my book, which is very short, by the way. That's the endorsement. It's a very short book. And that might help you get a better total sense of the framework from which I'm coming. And then I'd be happy to answer your question if you, on a later episode, if you allow me to kind of redefine things a little bit.
Let's do that. I would love to do that. I will read your book. I'll read it over the holidays, and let's re-engage after the first of the year. I'm really fascinated by this binary, but by what I think is a binary, but I'm open also to hearing ways that someone might answer it otherwise. When I asked David Wolpe that question, he wouldn't answer it. He said, I won't answer that. And but I think it's a valid question, and I think there may be answers to it that I haven't heard, and I would love to hear and ponder them. I've also posted several sort of short articles in addition to my piece that I mentioned earlier, where I talk about faith and what it is. And I get criticism. I get a lot of criticism from religious people saying that's not what we say faith is. So I kind of know where you're coming from to some extent, but I'm still confused about what the position is then from various
Sure.
religious people. And the
So
last thing I'll say is that I know very little about Eastern Orthodox religion. So so I'm happy to be enlightened by you about what that religion holds in answer to these kinds of things. Sorry to interrupt you. Go ahead.
No, that's fine. So can you just send me like whatever you think is the most sort of concise and thorough, contradictory treatment of this the way you're framing this question? Like, send me something, an article or a video that kind of
I will.
that lays it out in the best you think.
Yeah, I'll send you an article on that, and I'll read your book, and we maybe have some correspondence if you want in the meantime. But then let's chat again. I enjoyed this, and I'd love to plumb that question.
Yeah, that sounds great. And then give me a little bit. We're like just redoing my house right now because of mold. It's kind of a disaster.
And you have a 2-year-old. And I know what that means. So
yeah. Oh, I love it. She's wonderful. But it's not cakewalk.
I know all about it. Well, look, enjoy parenting, enjoy the holidays.
I will.
And it was a pleasure chatting with you.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Oh, before we go, where can people follow you and read more of your stuff and just sort of keep track of what you do?
Oh yeah. So I mean, I'm on a lot of random platforms right now because there's all these different ways you can listen to my podcast, and Ancient Faith hosts the channel on YouTube called The Roots of Everything. But there's different places. So the the place that everything's in one place is on my Substack. So zacharyporcu.substack.com. Pretty much everything, links to everything is all cross-posted there. And then my book is just on Amazon. It's called Journey to Reality. And you can get it on Amazon Prime. It's very easy.
Sounds good. Thank you. We'll put some links to that stuff in the notes under this video, and I'll let you know when it's up on YouTube.
Sounds great.
Thanks, Zach. Great talking.
Great talking to you. I will be in touch.
Enjoy Christmas.
You too. Bye-bye.